Abigail lost her father, her home, and her dignity to a ruthless baron who thought a heavy-set woman wouldn't fight back. Left freezing in the mud of a booming frontier town, she had nothing left to lose. Then, a towering shadow stepped out of the blizzard, holding a Winchester. In the autumn of 1884, the town of Red Creek, Wyoming, was a place where morality was bought with silver and enforced by the barrel of a Colt. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape carved out of the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. For 24 years, Abigail Prescott had known no other home. Abigail was not a woman who fit the delicate, porcelain doll ideals of the Victorian era. She was a woman of substantial size, heavy-set with broad shoulders, thick hips, and a soft, full face. In the frontier, a woman's worth was often cruelly measured by her marital prospects, and the shallow men of Red Creek had spent years casting cruel whispers behind her back. They called her Big Abby when they thought she couldn't hear. But Abigail had never let the town's prejudice break her. She possessed a sharp mind, a resilient spirit, and a heart large enough to match her frame. She worked grueling, 14-hour days alongside her father, Samuel Prescott, running the valley's most lucrative operation, the Prescott Lumber Mill and Way Station. Samuel was a fiercely independent man who adored his daughter, consistently telling her that her strength was the foundation of their empire. Together, they owned the prime timberland along the river and the only reliable freshwater well for 20 miles. But Samuel's sudden death in late October changed everything. The town doctor, a man known to drink heavily, hastily declared it a simple case of heart failure. Abigail, however, had seen the strange, bluish tint to her father's lips and the overturned coffee cup on his desk. Before the dirt had even settled on Samuel's grave, Harrison Caldwell made his move. Caldwell was the most powerful man in Red Creek. He owned the bank, the grandest saloon in town, and, effectively, the law. A man of immaculate tailored suits and cold reptilian eyes, Caldwell had spent years trying to buy the Prescott land. Samuel had always refused. The morning after the funeral, Caldwell arrived at the way station, accompanied by Sheriff Amos Tucker. He didn't offer condolences. Instead, he slapped a leather-bound folder onto Abigail's dining table. "It's a tragedy, Miss Prescott," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "But your father kept secrets, specifically a mountain of gambling debts and delinquent loans drawn against this very property." Abigail stared at the documents in horror. "My father despised gambling, Mr. Caldwell. He never borrowed a dime from your bank. We ran a cash operation. The signatures say otherwise," Sheriff Tucker interjected, resting a hand heavily on his gun belt. Abigail snatched the papers. The signatures were shaky. The ink smeared a poor imitation of Samuel's bold, steady hand. "These are obvious forgeries," she shouted, her face flushing with indignant heat. "You poisoned him, and now you're stealing his legacy." Caldwell's eyes narrowed, dropping his polite facade. "You're hysterical, Abigail! And frankly, given your immense proportions, I imagine the stress is terrible for your health. Sheriff Tucker has validated these claims. You have exactly 1 hour to pack whatever you can carry. Everything else belongs to the Red Creek Mutual Bank." The eviction was brutally public. The townspeople, many of whom Abigail had served, fed, and extended credit to during hard winters, stood on the boardwalks and watched. Some looked away in shame, but others, particularly the snobbish wives of Caldwell's associates, like Beatrice Gable, smirked at the sight of the heavy woman being escorted out into the cold dust. Abigail lost everything. The sprawling log home she had grown up in, the lumber mill, the horses, and the savings hidden in the floorboards. She was left with nothing but a single carpet bag of clothes. She sought help from the local magistrate, Judge Harlan Davis, but was turned away at his door. Caldwell had bought them all. Within a week, Abigail was destitute. The woman who had once been the heiress to the valley's greatest fortune was reduced to taking shelter in the drafty hayloft of a livery stable owned by Margaret Dunlap, an elderly widow who was too terrified of Caldwell to offer anything more than a pile of horse blankets. To survive, Abigail took on the hardest labor available. She became a washerwoman for the miners, hauling massive boiling iron pots of water, scrubbing filthy clothes until her knuckles bled and her broad back screamed in agony. The physical toll was devastating. The winter was creeping in, and the freezing winds bit through her threadbare coat. The town that had once respected her father now openly mocked her. Drunken miners would deliberately kick mud onto the clothes she had just hung on the line, laughing as she was forced to wash them all over again. Yet, beneath the exhaustion and the tears she shed in the dark of the hayloft, a slow-burning fire of vengeance began to kindle in Abigail's chest. She discovered a crucial piece of information while scrubbing the fine linen shirts of Caldwell's attorneys. Caldwell wasn't just expanding his lumber business. He had struck a secret, multi-million-dollar deal with the Union Pacific Railroad. The rail spur had to go straight through the Prescott property to access the mountain pass. Her land was worth an absolute fortune. She just needed to survive long enough to reach the federal circuit judge in Cheyenne to expose the forged deeds. But Caldwell, always paranoid, realized she wasn't leaving town. He realized she was building a case, and he decided it was time to remove Big Abby from Red Creek permanently. The first major blizzard of 1884 hit Red Creek with terrifying ferocity. The sky turned a bruising purple, and the wind howled through the wooden slats of the town like a wounded animal. Abigail was out behind the livery stable, desperately trying to pull the frozen laundry from the lines before the ice tore the fabric. Her fingers were numb, her breath pluming in thick white clouds. She was so focused on the freezing pain in her hands that she didn't hear the crunch of boots in the snow until it was too late. Jasper Flynn, Caldwell's chief enforcer, stepped around the corner of the stable, accompanied by 2 other armed thugs. Flynn was a vicious, scarred man who enjoyed his work far too much. "You're working awfully hard for a dead woman, Abby," Flynn sneered, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the pristine snow. Abigail backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stood tall, refusing to cower, using her size to hold her ground. "Get off Mrs. Dunlap's property, Jasper." "Mr. Caldwell is tired of looking at you," Flynn said, stepping closer. "He says you're a blight on the town, a fat, stubborn cow that doesn't know when to wander off and die. He's generously bought you a one-way stagecoach ticket to nowhere. You're leaving tonight." "I'm not going anywhere," Abigail spat. "I know about the railroad, Jasper. I know about the forged deeds. I'm going to Cheyenne, and Caldwell is going to hang." Flynn's eyes went dead. "No, you ain't." He lunged forward, shoving Abigail hard in the chest. Despite her weight and sturdy stance, the ice beneath her boots gave way. She crashed to the frozen ground, her elbow striking a rock with a sickening crack. Pain flared up her arm, blinding her for a second. The thugs laughed. Flynn stepped forward, drawing his heavy leather belt from his waist, wrapping it around his fist. "I'm going to beat you until you can't walk, and then we're going to throw you in the back of a freight wagon," Flynn promised, raising his fist. Abigail braced for the blow, squeezing her eyes shut. But the blow never came. Instead, there was a wet, heavy thud, followed by a wet gasp. Abigail opened her eyes to see Flynn staggering backward, clutching a shattered jaw. Standing in his place was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the mountains. Gideon Cole was a towering figure, draped in a heavy wolfskin coat. He possessed broad, squared shoulders and a rugged, weathered face marked by a jagged, pale scar that ran from his temple to his jawline, the unmistakable mark of a grizzly. His eyes were the color of slate, cold and utterly fearless. In his massive hands, he casually held a Winchester rifle by the barrel, having just used the heavy brass stock to crush Flynn's jaw. The other 2 thugs reached for their revolvers, but Gideon moved with a terrifying fluid speed that betrayed his size. Before their guns even cleared their holsters, Gideon drew a massive hunting knife from his belt and pressed the blade tight against the throat of the nearest man, while jamming the barrel of the Winchester into the gut of the other. "The lady told you to leave," Gideon's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, barely rising above the howling wind. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. The men froze. Flynn, spitting blood and teeth into the snow, glared at Gideon. "You don't know who you're messing with, mountain man. We work for Harrison Caldwell." Gideon didn't blink. "Tell Caldwell that Gideon Cole is back in the valley, and tell him if I see any of you dogs near this woman again, I won't use the stock of my rifle. I'll use the bullets." He shoved the thugs backward. Terrified by the lethal stillness of the stranger, the three men scrambled away into the blinding snow. Gideon turned his attention to Abigail. He didn't offer a condescending smile or treat her like a fragile, broken thing. He knelt in the snow, his sharp eyes assessing her. He extended a massive, calloused hand. "Can you stand, miss?" he asked respectfully. Abigail hesitated, her pride warring with her pain. But she looked into his slate-gray eyes and saw no pity, no judgment about her size or her dirty clothes. She took his hand. With a gentle but immense strength, Gideon pulled her to her feet as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. I am Abigail Prescott," she stammered, brushing the snow from her ruined skirt. "Thank you, but you shouldn't have done that. Caldwell will kill you for interfering." "Caldwell and I have a history," Gideon said quietly. He retrieved her fallen basket of laundry. "You're freezing, Miss Prescott, and that arm needs setting." He escorted her back into the warmth of the livery stable. As he expertly bound her bruised arm, the silence between them was thick with unasked questions. Finally, Abigail couldn't hold back. "Why did you tell them you were back in the valley?" she asked. "I know everyone who comes through Red Creek. I've never seen you." Gideon finished tying the bandage, his expression darkening. 10 years ago, before this town was anything more than a trading post, I was a land surveyor for the federal government. I was the one who drew the original maps of the river valley. I found a massive underground silver vein beneath the riverbed, right on the land your father eventually bought. Abigail gasped. "Silver? Not just the railroad?" "The railroad is just the cover," Gideon explained. "Caldwell paid my partner to bury the survey report. When I threatened to expose them, Caldwell's men ambushed me in the Bitterroots. They left me for dead. I've spent the last decade surviving up in the high country, waiting for Caldwell to make a mistake." He looked directly into Abigail's eyes, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of warmth in the rugged mountain man. "I saw what they did to your father, Abigail. I know you're trying to fight him, but you can't fight an army from a hayloft. I have a fortified cabin up the ridge, safe from Caldwell's men, and I have the original, signed survey maps, proving Caldwell's fraud. I need a partner to help me bring him down. Someone who knows the town, knows his routines. Someone strong." Abigail looked at her bruised, exhausted hands, then at the towering, quiet man who had just saved her life. The town had discarded her, mocked her weight, and left her to die. But Gideon Cole looked at her and saw a warrior. "Mr. Cole," Abigail said, a fierce, beautiful determination hardening her features. "When do we leave?" The trek up into the frozen, jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains was a grueling test of endurance. The storm grew more vicious with every 1,000 feet of elevation they gained, the wind turning into a deafening scream that threatened to rip the breath straight from Abigail's lungs. The snow was knee-deep, pulling at her boots like wet cement. For a woman of her immense size, every step was an exercise in pure agony. Her thighs burned, her breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps, and the cold seeped into her bones, turning her heavy limbs to lead. Several times, Abigail stumbled, her knees giving way beneath her weight. She expected the familiar mockery, the standard sighs of irritation she had grown accustomed to from the townspeople of Red Creek whenever her size slowed things down. But Gideon Cole never laughed. He never sighed. Whenever she faltered, the towering mountain man simply adjusted the heavy pack on his broad shoulders, turned back, and planted his massive, steady hands firmly under her arms. With an effortless, respectful strength, he lifted her back to her feet, anchoring her against the howling blizzard. "Take your time, Abigail," Gideon said, his deep voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "The mountain doesn't care how fast you climb it. It only cares that you don't stop walking. By the time they reached his sanctuary, night had fallen completely, casting the world in a deep, treacherous blue. Gideon's cabin was a fortress of thick, hand-hewn cedar logs, built flush against a massive granite cliff face that shielded it from the worst of the northern gales. Inside, the air smelled of dried pine needles, cured venison, and wood smoke. Gideon moved with efficient, practiced movements. Within minutes, a roaring fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. He handed Abigail a thick, heavy woolen blanket and served her a bowl of steaming, rich stew made from wild elk and root vegetables. It was the first hot, filling meal she had eaten since her father's funeral, and as the warmth flooded her body, she began to weep. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping a tear from her full cheek with her bruised hand. "I used to be so strong. Now look at me." Gideon sat across from her on a rough-cut wooden stool, cleaning the mechanism of his Winchester. He looked up, his slate-gray eyes fierce and steady. "You are strong, Abigail. Those fools in Red Creek think strength is something you can measure on a cattle scale. They think it's about being small and fragile so a man can feel big. But I've seen men half your size curl up and die in a blizzard like this within an hour. You hauled water in the freezing cold. You bore their insults, and you kept your head high. That's the kind of strength that breaks iron." For the first time in years, Abigail felt truly seen. Not as a joke, not as an eyesore, but as a human being of value. Over the next 2 weeks, the cabin became a war room. Gideon pulled a loose floorboard from beneath his bed and retrieved a sealed leather tube. Inside were the pristine official Federal Land Survey maps from 10 years prior, bearing the stamp of the United States Department of the Interior. The maps clearly detailed the massive silver vein running directly under the Prescott property line, and they bore the signature of Gideon's former partner, Arthur Pendleton, alongside Harrison Caldwell's personal notary stamp. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of a decade-long conspiracy of land theft and attempted murder. But as the days passed, a profound and unexpected tenderness bloomed between the heavy-set woman and the solitary mountain man. They found solace in each other's scars. Abigail spoke of the crushing loneliness of her life in town, the cruel laughter that had kept her isolated, and the deep love she had held for her father. Gideon spoke of the brutal betrayal by his partner and the long, silent winters where the only thing keeping him alive was the burning need for justice. One evening, while a gentle snow fell outside, Gideon reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. His palm was rough as sandpaper, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "When this is over, Abigail," he murmured, his gaze locking onto hers, "the town will try to give you back your father's house. But I'm hoping you might choose to stay up here, with me." Abigail's heart leaped. Before she could answer, the silence of the mountain was shattered by the distant, sharp crack of a rifle. Gideon was on his feet in an instant, blowing out the oil lamp and grabbing his Winchester. He moved to the narrow window, peering out into the moonlit snow. "Horses," he whispered grimly. "At least 10 of them. They found us." Harrison Caldwell hadn't waited for them to come to town. He had hired a notorious gang of cutthroats from the Southern Territories, led by a ruthless bounty hunter named Silas Vance. They had tracked Gideon's snowshoe prints before the storm could fully erase them. "Come out, Cole," a voice shouted from the darkness of the tree line, "and bring the fat girl with you. Caldwell sent his regards, and he wants this finished tonight." Gideon turned to Abigail, his face hard as stone. "The chimney flue leads to a narrow crawl space behind the woodpile outside. If they breach the cabin, you run. Take the maps and get to the federal marshal in Cheyenne." "No," Abigail said, her voice ringing with an absolute immovable authority. She stood up, throwing off the blanket. "I am done running from Harrison Caldwell. This is my fight. Gideon, tell me what to do." Gideon stared at her for a split second, a proud, lethal smile touching his lips. "Load the Henry rifle. Keep the extra cartridges in your apron. When I open fire, you watch the back window." The battle for the ridge was brutal. The cutthroats swarmed the cabin, firing volleys of lead that shattered the glass and chewed through the heavy wooden door. Gideon was a specter of death, moving from window to window, his Winchester barking with lethal accuracy. Abigail worked with feverish speed, her large, capable hands reloading the rifles, her heart pounding, but her mind entirely clear. When a man tried to axe his way through the rear shutters, Abigail didn't hesitate. She lifted the heavy Henry rifle, aimed at the shadow through the splintering wood, and pulled the trigger. The kickback bruised her shoulder, but a scream of pain from outside told her she had hit her mark. But the numbers were against them. A dynamite stick sailed through the broken front window, landing on the hearth. "Get down!" Gideon roared, lunging across the room to tackle Abigail to the floor. The explosion blasted the cabin apart, throwing them into darkness, burying them in smoke, shattered logs, and burning embers. When the smoke cleared, Abigail groaned, coughing violently. She was covered in ash, but her thick winter coat had shielded her from the worst of the blast. She looked down. Gideon lay beside her, unconscious, a deep gash on his forehead bleeding profusely, a heavy fallen beam pinning his legs. Through the shattered front doorway, Silas Vance stepped into the ruined cabin, a smoking Colt revolver in his hand, flanked by Jasper Flynn and Harrison Caldwell himself. Caldwell looked around the destruction, his expensive leather boots stepping over the debris, his face twisted in a look of triumphant disgust. "Well, look at this," Caldwell sneered, looking down at Abigail as she crawled over Gideon's body to shield him. "The mountain man and the cow, buried in the rubble. It's almost poetic." "You're a monster, Caldwell," Abigail hissed, her voice raw, her body shaking with rage as she held Gideon close. "I am a businessman, Miss Prescott," Caldwell corrected coldly. He turned to Flynn. "Search the place. Find the maps Cole took 10 years ago. Then burn what's left of this shack to the ground with both of them inside. The law will find nothing but charred bones." Flynn began tearing the cabin apart, overturning the heavy table and smashing the remaining cabinets. But he missed the loose floorboard under the bed where the maps were hidden. Caldwell turned his back, walking out into the snow to prepare the horses. Vance followed him to secure the perimeter. Flynn was left alone in the ruined cabin with the two wounded souls. Flynn smiled wickedly, drawing his hunting knife. He stepped toward the unconscious Gideon. "I think I'll finish the big guy first, just so you can watch, Abby." But Flynn underestimated the fury of a woman who had lost everything and had finally found something worth fighting for. As Flynn stepped closer, Abigail's hand brushed against a heavy iron fire poker lying in the ashes, her fingers wrapped around the cold metal. With a burst of explosive, desperate strength powered by her massive frame, she lunged upward. Before Flynn could react, Abigail swung the heavy iron poker with all her might. It struck Flynn squarely across the side of his head with a horrific, echoing crack. The impact fractured his skull, sending his knife flying. Flynn collapsed into the dirt and ashes, dead before he hit the ground. Abigail didn't waste a single second. She threw her entire weight against the heavy beam pinning Gideon's legs, straining until the wood groaned and shifted. Freeing him, she dragged him toward the chimney crawl space, pulling him into the freezing night air just as she grabbed the leather tube containing the maps from the hidden floorboard. They escaped into the blinding snow, using Gideon's secret mountain trails to evade the remaining guards. 2 days later, frostbitten, exhausted, but completely unbroken, they rode into the neighboring town of Laramie on a stolen pack mule, straight to the office of the United States Federal Marshal, Warren Vance. On the 12th of December, 1884, the reckoning finally came to Red Creek. The morning train arrived, but it didn't bring merchants or railroad tycoons. It brought a squad of 20 heavily armed federal marshals, led by Marshal Vance, and riding at the front of the column side by side were Gideon Cole and Abigail Prescott. The townspeople gathered on the boardwalks, gasping in shock. Abigail was no longer wearing the dirty rags of a washerwoman. She sat high in a grand leather saddle, wearing a fine wool riding cloak, her head held high, looking every bit the proud heiress of the valley. Beside her, Gideon sat like a mountain king, his Winchester resting across his lap. They marched straight to Harrison Caldwell's bank. Caldwell was standing on the porch, flanked by Sheriff Amos Tucker and the corrupt Judge Harlan Davis. "What is the meaning of this?" Caldwell demanded, though his face had gone completely pale at the sight of Gideon Cole alive. Marshal Vance stepped forward, pulling a federal arrest warrant from his coat. "Harrison Caldwell, Amos Tucker, and Harlan Davis, by order of the United States Circuit Court, you are under arrest for federal land fraud, forgery, and the conspiracy to murder a federal officer." "This is an outrage!" Judge Davis shouted. "I am the law in this town. On what evidence?" Abigail rode her horse right up to the edge of the porch, looking down at the men who had brought her to her knees. She reached into her cloak and drew out the original federal survey maps, unrolling them for the entire town to see. "On the evidence of the United States government, Judge Davis," Abigail declared, her voice booming across the town square, filled with an undeniable authority. "And on the word of the Prescott family, you forged my father's name. You stole our land, and you murdered him to hide the silver beneath our feet. Your reign in Red Creek is over." Sheriff Tucker reached for his gun, but Gideon's Winchester was already lined up with his chest. "Don't even think about it, Amos," Gideon rumbled, defeated, terrified of the federal marshals and the wrath of the townspeople who were suddenly turning against them. The three men slowly raised their hands into the freezing winter air. The marshals clamped heavy iron shackles around Caldwell's manicured wrists, dragging him down into the very mud he had forced Abigail to wash clothes in. The crowd erupted into cheers. The very townspeople who had mocked Abigail now stepped forward, trying to apologize, trying to shake her hand, but she ignored them all. Their respect was fair weather, and she no longer needed it. By the spring of 1885, the Prescott Lumber Mill and Way Station was fully operational once more, inherited by its rightful owner. But Abigail didn't live in the grand log house in town. She left the management to a trusted foreman, visiting only to oversee the accounts. Instead, if you were to ride up into the high country of the Bighorn Mountains, past the timberline, where the air is clean and the world is quiet, you would find a beautiful, expanded cabin built against the granite cliff. There, living in absolute peace, was a heavy-set woman who had conquered a town, and the lone mountain man who had given her the strength to do it. They were two outcasts who had found their own empire, built not on silver or land, but on a love that was as unyielding as the mountains themselves. If this thrilling tale of frontier justice, betrayal, and true love touched your heart, don't let the fire fade. Hit that like button right now to show your support, and share this incredible Western story with your friends and family who love a real, gripping drama. Most importantly, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another epic, breathtaking historical storytelling video.